Wow, great crowd. We've got, let's see, a few hours before it starts snowing. Look around, this may be the biggest bunch of people you'll all be with for a week or something after it snows and freezes over. Good afternoon. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, who's out of sight there, but present. And we are really, truly delighted to be hosting, yet again, veteran broadcaster Marvin Kalb, who's here to talk about his new book, A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course. And he, of course, is here with Ted Koppel, and together, the two of them were just figuring how many years experience they have. It's something like 132 years in journalism. I mean, this is an incredible couple here. I mean, we are so privileged to have them both. This is Marvin's 18th book, and I think he's spoken at P&P for at least 10 or 11 of them. Let's just say we never get tired of hosting Marvin. Of course, he's very familiar to many news watchers, certainly those of us of a certain age who recall when Marvin was a fixture on the nightly news. His broadcast career spanned more than 3 decades at CBS and NBC. He was bureau chief in Moscow, chief diplomatic correspondent in Washington, and anchor of NBC's Meet the Press. He's been a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School and was founding director of Harvard's Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. In 2017, Marvin began publishing what has become a series of memoirs. The first volume, which was called The Year I Was Peter the Great, was set in 1956 when Marvin worked at the US Embassy in Moscow. A second volume in 2021, Assignment Russia, recounted Marvin's start as a journalist in 1957 as one of the so-called Murrow boys at CBS, and then his return to Moscow, not as a diplomat, but as a foreign correspondent. And in his new book, Marvin details the particularly fascinating period in US-Soviet relations that he covered as a correspondent in Moscow. It was the early 1960s, which of course was an especially dangerous time in the Cold War, marked by a growing confrontation between President Kennedy and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. As Marvin explains, Khrushchev was a very different personality, a very different Moscow leader than we've become used to in Vladimir Putin. Khrushchev wasn't a cold, calculating former intelligence officer like Putin, seemingly uninterested in accommodation with the West. Rather, he was an emotional, unpredictable, one-time metal worker who, as head of the Soviet Union, was open to summit meetings with the US and available for possible compromise. Among the key challenges in US-Soviet relations at that time were the construction of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Marvin describes how Kennedy and Khrushchev faced off over those and other issues, and also how they ultimately managed to conclude a nuclear test ban treaty shortly before Kennedy was assassinated. Marvin provides not only a close-up and insightful perspective on the historic events he covered, but he also conveys what it was like being the Moscow correspondent back then for a major American television network, with all the excitement, the pressures, and the memorable experiences that entailed. In conversation with Marvin, as I said, will be Ted Koppel, another of the great journalists of our time. Ted spent 42 years with ABC News, where he became best known, of course, for anchoring Nightline from the program's inception in 1980 until 2005. Since leaving ABC, Ted's taken on a number of roles, including managing editor for the Discovery Channel, news analyst for NPR and the BBC, and contributor to Rock Center with Brian Williams. He's also been contributing to CBS News Sunday Morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marvin and Ted.
I am astonished. I thought we were going to have 3 or 4 people here. You are amazing. You clearly don't listen to the weather forecast. I'm just so delighted for Marvin. I really am.
Yes.
You know those. You know those lines that they put on yogurt and the use by date. Our use by dates expired a long time ago. We, in point of fact, do have, we just worked it out, 132 years of journalistic experience between the two of us.
No, but he shows promise. He shows promise, I think.
And I mean, just to give you a sense of how long ago Marvin began his work in Moscow, Putin was 10 years old. I just looked it up this morning. 10 years old. You could have done something with the son of a bitch, and you didn't. Oh, well. It was an extraordinary period because Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Communist Party at that time, he blew the whistle on what had been a particularly dark period that preceded him.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin. Do you remember that, Marvin? Do you remember when Khrushchev gave his famous speech? Were you there at the time?
Yes, I do remember. It was February 24th, 1956. Khrushchev had just finished a 4-day conference of the Soviet Communist Party. It was the 20th Party Congress, and it was fairly routine. Nothing much had happened. Agriculture a problem here and there. The United States always a problem. And all of the delegates left at midnight to go back to their hotel rooms. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, they all got word that they ought to return to the Kremlin immediately because Khrushchev had something he wanted to say. And so everybody went back. We're talking about a couple of thousand people. They were all quite obedient. They got the word, they went back. Khrushchev then delivered a 4-hour speech that was called the secret speech, in which for the first time since 1924, a communist leader had the guts to attack the memory of Joseph Stalin and to point out that during World War II, Stalin was the one who refused to accept the notion that the Nazis were about to attack. And the Nazis attacked, and the Russians, in effect, opened the door for them at the very beginning of World War II. Khrushchev also pointed out that throughout the 1930s, people were arbitrarily being picked up, sent off to Siberia, or killed because they had said something wrong about Stalin. And he was pointing out that what was going on in Russia was wrong. And Khrushchev was the sort of leader who was powerfully nationalistic, believed deeply in the potential of the Russian people, and felt that they were being held back by Stalin. And he had the guts, I use that word a second time now, to say that. There's a story that we heard at the embassy within a couple of weeks, that a number of people, and they put the number at 8, but I wouldn't bet on that at all, but that a number of people, communists, hearing that Stalin was being attacked, publicly attacked in front of thousands of communists, had heart attacks and died on the spot. It was that much of a shock to the system. And if you lived in Russia in the year 1956, and I did, you could feel, Ted, the impact that the speech had. The speech itself was not published until June of that year. But you could pick up little bits and pieces of it along the way. And very good diplomats could pick up a piece, and the American ambassador, Charles Boland, was among the very best. And he began to hear, principally from Israeli diplomats, that the speech had been delivered and Stalin had been attacked. And you could see the impact rippling through. I remember vividly standing in front of the Metropole Hotel on a weekend and having a number of people sort of come over to me and in fractured English say that they had just come back from Siberia and they had been released. And they were human symbols of the beginning of the change that Khrushchev wanted to see happen throughout the Soviet Union. He simply believed that the Russian people deserved better, and he was going to try to make that happen.
Talk a little bit, Marvin, about the trade of journalists in Russia at that time. We live in an age now in which we have substituted speed and technology for depth. But depth was not easily achieved.
No.
How did you find out what was going on? It was still very much a closed society, even under Khrushchev.
No. That's one of the things I tried to write, but in, I hope, an interesting way, about what it was like to be a journalist, a Western journalist in the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War, when the fear of a nuclear war was in the air. The tension between East and West was very acute. And as a Western correspondent, we were not regarded with pleasure by any Soviet official. And so if you asked a Soviet official for information, the likelihood is he would ignore you and walk right past you. Interestingly, the one who began to open the system a little bit was Khrushchev himself. And one of the things that happened is that when there was a reception, an ambassador held a reception in his embassy, and he would invite the leadership of the Soviet Union, and the Western press corps would show up, because that would be the only opportunity we had to even see these people. But Khrushchev being Khrushchev, he took it into his head that he wanted the best of Russia to be projected out to the world. And he was saying to himself and others, we shouldn't be so frightened of who we are. We are a great people. And then he would tick off names of great writers of the 19th and 18th centuries. But he would try to open Russia in that way. And therefore, I had a bit of a special relationship with Khrushchev.
We should point out that you are, I don't know if you still are today, but back then you were a fluent Russian speaker. How did that come about?
Well, it came about because when I was in college, I started studying Russian language, and there was a marvelous professor at City College named Hans Kohn, K-O-H-N, who opened my eyes, really, to the beauty of Russian literature and Russian philosophy and East European, the whole concept of what was going on out there. And I started studying that in college and then went on to the Russian Research Center at Harvard and worked my way toward a PhD, but never did get the degree, but did everything up to that point. So I studied the language at Harvard, where I tried also to study Chinese, but I failed on that. But at the Russian Research Center, we learned a lot about the economics of the Soviet Union, the politics, everything that was going on there. Again, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and they were our adversary. And I thought it was interesting, not just academically, but just as an American, as a reporter, what the heck is going on there? So in the back of my mind was always the desire to be a reporter in Moscow. And that opportunity opened itself when Murrow read something that I had written for the New York Times Magazine about Soviet youth. He called me up at Harvard and asked me to come down and talk to him in New York. His secretary said, "You have 30 minutes, and then Ed is very busy, and you've got to get going." And 3 hours later, she came back and said, "You're going to be late for lunch." He was an incredible journalist. He asked questions about every aspect of Russian life, about what it was like to be a young person, about religion, about going to school, about sex, about everything. And I answered as best I could. And when the 3 hours passed and Murrow was going off to lunch, he stopped, put his arm around me, and he said, "How would you like to join CBS?" And I said, "Would you give me a second or two to think about that?" Yeah. And so that was the end of my dissertation and the beginning of a career as a reporter. And Murrow was the one, more than anyone, in 1959, who sort of worked me through the bureaucracy at CBS, and there was a big bureaucracy. And in May, at the time of the Paris summit, Murrow and the management sent me off to be the Moscow correspondent. And I had never been a foreign correspondent. I didn't really know very much about the business, but what I did know was about the country.
Talk about, there are really two bureaucracies here that you had to deal with. One was the Russian bureaucracy, and the other was Russian bureaucracy.
Oh, yes.
And the other was the network bureaucracy. And
the Russians were easier.
I was about to say, I think people need to understand how different things were back in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Can you imagine, for example, today, one of the major networks doing a 1-hour special in prime time because Putin has done something extraordinary, like invading Ukraine? Just talk a little bit about what it was like being a network correspondent, being a bureau chief in Moscow in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay. I said before that the entire environment was clouded by the Cold War. There was a feeling of imminent danger. There was a sense that something big is about to happen. And as a reporter, you had a responsibility to try as best you could to come up with that information. How do you get that information? One way is to read the Soviet press very, very carefully. 99% of it was pure propaganda. And after you read it for a while, you knew what the propaganda was. But every now and then there's a Russian word, однако, which in English is however. And in an editorial, they would sometimes have that word однако at the beginning of a paragraph, and suddenly something was written about that was different from the line, or that things began to shift. And if you read the Russian press carefully every day, which I did, you got to understand how it was possible, one, for the Russian people to be brainwashed, which is what they were, by a line that was so persistent, hammered away at them, there was no escape. But if you were the journalist on the outside, your responsibility was to appreciate what the Russian people were going through. And I made it my business to go to the marketplace, just on the outside of Moscow, to talk to Russian farmers who would come in with their goods to be sold. That was my opportunity to talk to the Russian people. And I had what they were saying to me, and I would I was never belligerent with them. I would simply ask them what their thinking was about, for example, when we entered the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when right after Kennedy had delivered his very famous speech on October 22nd, in Russia, they knew nothing about it. They had not been told about it. And so if I went into the marketplace, which I did every morning in that critical week, and find out what are these people thinking, then I would measure that against what was in the press. Then if there was a reception and I would go there and Khrushchev or I would see him, he'd see me, and we sort of had this relationship where he would kind of nod, and he meant for me to come over. And I think the only reason he did that was I was the tallest among the reporters then. But anyway, we went on over, and Khrushchev just took any question.
Don't slide past it. He called you Peter the Great.
He called me Peter the Great.
Yes.
He called me Peter the Great because the first time I met him was at the July 4th party at the American Embassy in 1956. And there were only 4 of us at the embassy who spoke Russian. So Ambassador Bolin put me on to Marshal Zhukov, who was the defense minister of the Soviet Union. I had been a PFC in the United States Army. So the relationship was a bit absurd. But I began to talk to him. He was very nice. I built up his ego about his greatness in World War II. And he said, "Have you met our great leader?" I said, "No." So he said, "Come with me." And we walked over, and Khrushchev was standing there with Bolin. And Khrushchev looked up at me, and he said, "How tall are you?" And honestly, to this day, I have no idea why I answered the way I did. But I answered, "I am 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." At which point he burst into laughter. And from that time on, he called me Peter the Great, which was, when I returned as a journalist, a great asset, because he sort of knew me and the joke and all, so he would call me over. So when you put the press together with the marketplace, with that occasional insight from Khrushchev and other senior officials who came along with him, and the German ambassador, who was a superb diplomat and sort of knew everything that the Politburo was thinking, you got a sense, Ted, of what was happening. There were no announcements. You had to put it all together. And it's, in the State Department, they called it Kremlinology. I called it good reporting. And the point that you were making before is a very important one. In those days, CBS and NBC and ABC and the Times and the Post and the Herald Tribune, they were all interested in those little shifts in the Soviet position. And CBS ran stuff that I did that when I think about it today would never be on air, simply because maybe we as a people are not interested, or the people who run the networks are not interested. Whatever the reason, then they were, because of the Cold War, because of the time we lived in. And if I broadcast that there appeared to be a shift in the Soviet position on Berlin, they listen. And most of the time, this is not a boast, believe me, most of the time I was right, because if you did what I did, you would come up with that same kind of analysis.
There was a mosaic of sources. You would have the occasional Russian official
Right.
who might talk to you. You might, on very rare occasions, actually be able to talk to Khrushchev,
Right.
or someone like him. But you also depended to a large extent on what your colleagues, some of them from Eastern European countries, journalists who had a different kind of access to what was going on. I'm trying to get you to sort of sketch out for us what it was like being what you were, a very good reporter at that time.
Oh, thank you, Ted. I had a very, very good friend who was an Italian journalist, Enrico Levi, worked at Corriere della Sera. And he had an uncanny ability to sort of sniff a story about to break. He also had, because he was very good friends with all of the Italian reporters and the French reporters. That included communist reporters. That was very important, because Arrigo would be able to talk to the communist reporter who had just been briefed by his ambassador, who had just been briefed by someone on the Central Committee. And so if you could deal with somebody, and it was a great pleasure, like Arrigo, there was a French journalist, very similar to Arrigo, who had, Michel Tachou, he had phenomenal contacts with the French communist reporters, who had contacts with the Soviet propaganda establishment. The upshot was that they had insights that the American press never got. And so if you opened your eyes to other opportunities to pick up information, you would also, before you went anywhere, for example, there was, on one occasion, there was a rumor circulating about that the Russians were about to send a man into space. It was a big deal in early 1961. Who would win the space race, the Russians or the Americans? There was, as I said, there was kind of a rumor floating about. The minute I heard the rumor, I immediately called Arrigo. Arrigo, would you hear anything about a rumor going around about space? And he said, well, you've probably read the same thing that I have. And there had been a couple of articles written in scientific journals, Russian scientific journals, which did not give you any headlines, but gave you little hints. And every now and then would throw in a fact. So if you made an effort to talk to people at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which I tried to do, it wasn't easy. Most of the time the door was shut, but you kept trying. And so there was always somebody. I had a phone number. I could talk to somebody. And if Arrigo gave me an idea, that this is real, it was based on something. What Arrigo did was to call the chief diplomatic correspondent of his newspaper, based in Rome, occasionally up in Geneva, and he would ask the question, do you know anything about the Russians sending a man into space? He said, no, I haven't, but I can find out. How would he find out? He found out by turning to the local head of the National Communist Party, in this case, the Italian Communist Party. Now, we're not talking journalism here. This is Communist Party stuff, and they were all hooked in a sort of common form union. And those people picked up what it is that the Soviet Central Committee people knew. They did not necessarily know what Khrushchev was doing at the Politburo, but they were close. So the Italian diplomatic correspondent, checking with the head of the Italian Communist Party, he would then check with his contact in Moscow. He would get some information, pass it back to him, who would then pass it to Arrigo, who would give it to me. So did I know that this was? No. But I sure had a sense that something was going on now. And I could call my scientist friend in quotes, and ask a question as simple as, are you expecting a Soviet man in space? Oh, yes, of course. We have great science. I said, but do you expect it soon? And then there'd be a pause. And then, well, you're not answering my question. No. Soon? And he'd walk away. So it was soon. You had a kind of response. And when you reported that stuff, at that time, what did I didn't have a bulletin. I had something indicating that the Russians were thinking about it. And then there was a dreadful man who was at the Moscow radio, whose only word in the Russian language was "niet." And every time I asked him for any kind of assistance, it was "niet." But before I went on the air on that first piece, I asked him, are you now expecting anything to happen? And he said, "Нет, может быть." No, but maybe. For him to say maybe was a loud yes. And I would ask, so how are you going to cover it? Being an innocent, how are you going to cover it? And he said, it's none of your business how we cover it. You tune in and you'll know.
Let me just jump in.
Anyway, my point here, Ted, is simply that the people in New York were interested in these stories.
You anticipated my question. I can just imagine some young journalist today working for ABC, NBC, CBS, pursuing the same kind of reporting and coming up with little nuggets and calling New York excited. I've got something. And I can hear the yawn. It wouldn't make it on the air. And you came here, and I'd like to give you all an opportunity to pose your questions to Marvin. But before they do, and there's a microphone back here, and we've only got about 25 minutes to do it. But talk about the difference in being a journalist in Moscow today and when you were there in the 50s and 60s.
Well, Ted, remember that most American journalists are not in Moscow now. they're all justifiably concerned about what would happen if they, in some way or another, displeased Putin. And one of the aspects of this book that I'm particularly proud of is the section on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you don't mind, let me just talk a little bit about that. The subtitle of this book is Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course. From the time that I arrived as the Moscow correspondent, May 1960, both sides were on a collision course. We didn't know, we couldn't sense really where it would all end, but it always had to do with Berlin and the division of Berlin. And on this, Khrushchev would refer to it as a bone in my throat. He couldn't get over the awfulness of Berlin being split in two. He believed that it should be entirely his, and he would do whatever he could to get it. And he tried everything. He tried building a wall through Berlin. He tried frightening Finland into believing that Germany was about to attack the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would then have to fight against the United States. And in May of 1962, when he was on a trip to Bulgaria, he was told by his defense minister that American Jupiter missiles were in Turkey, just across the Black Sea, aimed at the Soviet Union, and they were operational. And Khrushchev, angry, really upset, screamed at Malinowski, "We're going to put hedgehogs down Uncle Sam's pants." And what he meant was that if they can put their missiles in Turkey, we're going to put ours into Cuba. And starting in May of '62, a massive operation involving 50,000 Russian troops and missiles, some of them with nuclear warheads, were moved from different bases all over the Soviet Union to ports on the Black Sea, onto ships across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, to Cuba, and it was done secretly for 5 months. The United States didn't know anything about it until the story finally broke on October 22nd, when the president announced, after he had given absolute information, intelligence information, that the missiles were being set up and aimed at a variety of American targets from Chicago to New York and a couple of others. And then we went into the Cuban crisis. Khrushchev on Sunday, the 28th, sent a letter to Kennedy in which he announced that he would begin the dismantling of missiles and send them crated back to the Soviet Union. And I was, at that time, I mean, every now and then the story was right there in your hand. I had set up circuits to New York. At 5 o'clock, I was told by this dreadful man who always said, "Niet," to listen in to the 5 o'clock newscast, which I did. And Yuri Levitan, the minute I heard his voice, I knew it was either war or peace. It was one or the other. And he announced immediately on the air, and we were hooked in to New York, so New York had it live. And at a certain point, I heard Levitan reading the letter and saying, "And therefore, the Soviet government now agrees to withdraw, to crate, and return the missiles." And I screamed, he just caved. He just caved. It's over. And why would Khrushchev admit publicly, why would he acknowledge that he had blown it, that he had made a mistake? because after what I was told is that Khrushchev was so hurt and impressed by the 40 million Russians estimated to have been killed during World War II. He wouldn't want it to happen again. And for him, he was willing to run the risk of publicly acknowledging that he had blown it.
There's one other little point, and you set the stage for it earlier on, and that is those Jupiter missiles in Turkey. It wasn't acknowledged at the time, but of course, in exchange for the Russians pulling their missiles out of Cuba, the United States ended up pulling those missiles out of Turkey.
The missiles were regarded by McNamara as a pile of junk, and so he could pull it out. But I have never believed, and don't believe now, that there was a deal. There was an exchange of conversations. John Scali, an ABC correspondent, had a conversation with a Russian diplomat. The two of them, sort of shooting the breeze, said, wouldn't it be terrific if there was an exchange of missiles? That did happen. It also happened that more senior Russian officials discussed the idea of a swap, missiles for missiles. But in my opinion, anyway, I do not believe for an instant that they reached that kind of an agreement. They discussed it, but it was not part of the agreement. It was never written in any document. The only time it even was listed was in the Khrushchev letter on Saturday, October 27, 1962. In that letter, he mentioned that there were American missiles, the Jupiter missile in Turkey, and that could be part of the negotiation. That was the closest that a Russian official of any importance got. I know that the story is around. I'm perfectly aware of it. I simply don't buy it.
Okay. We only have 15 minutes left. The microphone is back there. It's in your hands.
So my question is, do you think Kennedy's ability to get missiles out of Cuba was actually a Pyrrhic victory? Because within a year, I believe, Soviet nuclear subs had ballistic missiles off the coast of the United States. And was that ever in anybody's thinking about this, particularly the Soviets?
Yeah. Let me try to explain. There may be questions here that I am simply unable to answer. This book is written on the basis of the information I was able to get as a reporter at that time. There's tons of stuff written about what happened afterward. That was not my intent. I simply wanted to give you a sense of what it was like then. So I can't, I'm sorry. I can't.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much to both of you for being here today. I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington area, and I'm hoping ultimately to teach American history, which has for a long time been a strong interest of mine. My question is, as I was reading the book, I found it interesting reading about Shora, your family friend in Russia, and I was wondering if you would be able to speak some about Shora's background. For instance, I read that she never got married, and do you know what happened to her? Do you know what course her life took after your family's time in Russia?
I know that Shura was the maid, cook. She did everything for us. She was an absolutely marvelous woman. She was in her 40s. She was unmarried. And like millions of Russian women who were unmarried, that was because during World War II, the men whom they might have married were all killed. So there was a whole generation of Shuras who worked, 99% of them, in the system and a couple of them worked for an outfit called UPDK, which arranged for help for foreigners who lived in Moscow. Shura got a job for them, then worked, I think, at the British Embassy, and then she was assigned to CBS. Why? I have no idea. We were delighted to have her. She was as pure and beautiful a person, as you could ever meet.
Thank you.
I remember a lot of, I'm not quite as old as you, but close. So a lot of this I remember. Putin, how would you compare Putin to the Russian leadership that you knew? Is there anything we can do?
Well, no. The difference between Khrushchev and Putin, in a way, day and night, they are both Russian nationalists. They want what is best for Russia. They enter negotiations with an intent to get what it is that they want, what they consider in their interest. They're not doing us any favors.
Correct.
Khrushchev was not doing any favors by pulling out of Cuba. However, as I said earlier, Khrushchev sincerely wanted to improve the lives of Russian people. He wanted to improve what it is that they could read. I had the great honor, in a way, as it turned out, to have read a small thing called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which nobody in October of '62 knew anything about. I read it. It was in beautiful Russian. It was very short, and it hit me immediately. Why can't we have this? And I turned to a British communist journalist named Ralph Parker, who was putting that little booklet into English. And I said, Ralph, would you agree? And do you think the Russians would allow me to try to sell this to my publisher in the United States? He said, sure, much to my surprise. I then checked with the foreign ministry. They said yes, again, much to my surprise. And I called New York, and the owner, whose name slips my mind now, he said, absolutely, yes, but I want you to write an introduction. And I did, and 18 books, yes, but it's the one book that continues to provide cigarette money. Thank
I
you,
read
Liz.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Whether American speech, the Kalb Koppel voices, and the way you ask questions and answer them has me wondering, what can be done to improve American speech? For example, Mr. Koppel, you asked near verbatim, can you imagine a network doing a 1-hour special about Russia invading Ukraine? Today it might come out as, can you imagine a network doing a 1-hour special about Russia invading Ukraine? And also Uptalk, we're at Politics and Prose, as opposed to we're at Politics and Prose. And even the way you voiced the question, Mr. Koppel, you said it, not asked it. The word order made it perfectly clear it was a question. But rather than asking, can you imagine a network doing a 1-hour special about Russia invading Ukraine? You made it, can you imagine a network doing a 1-hour special about Russia invading Ukraine?
Oh dear. I'll answer. It's not really a question, it's a comment. And I'll answer it by telling you a very quick story. I was talking to very senior news producer at CBS. And I said, you know, I heard a rumor that a producer in New York is actually writing scripts which are then sent to the correspondent in Ukraine so that they will then deliver the news as it is perceived by the producer in New York. And my friend said, no, that's not true. And I sighed a sigh of relief. He said, it's not true. The producer is actually in New Jersey. Does that answer your question?
Beautifully.
Thank you.
Thanks for both being here. Appreciate it. Thank you. The Berlin Wall affected people dramatically differently on either side. In your understanding of Khrushchev and other key people, was it ever possible to avoid that, or do you think it was basically an inevitability that that would happen given his interests?
The inevitability being the building of the wall.
The building of the wall and the impact of the Iron Curtain, which really led to the Cold War. It felt like there's a moment in time where perhaps American diplomacy might have changed that. Was that ever a possibility, or do you think more or less it was kind of an inevitability?
My sense is that the division of Berlin was the key symbol in Khrushchev's mind, and I think in many Russians' minds, for the division of Europe, and that the East belonged to us, and you guys had the West. What they wanted was all. They wanted all of Germany, but they would start with all of Berlin. And for Khrushchev, the symbol of Berlin always brought him back to remembering World War II, which for him was a nightmare. So he wanted to solve that in any way that he could. And the wall was an act of desperation. The key thinkers at the time were all saying that this is an aggressive act by Khrushchev to do something that World War II agreements very explicitly ruled out. I never saw it that way. I believe that the building of the wall was an aggressive action. It was a roll of the dice, but the effect was to stop the flow of East Germans and East Europeans into the West. Why was that a problem? Because the flow had reached such dimensions from East to West that East Germany was on the edge of collapse. And if East Germany had collapsed, then the entire Warsaw Bloc group would have collapsed. You could argue immediately at that point, great, isn't that a terrific thing? Good for us. Yes, but if it had collapsed, the possibility of warfare, almost, if not inevitably, then almost logically, you would have a war. Because you would then be taking the system that both sides had more or less agreed to and breaking it. And that would be regarded on the Russian side as an act of unfriendliness leading toward military action. So there was a difference of opinion. And what was interesting, another interesting point here, Dan Shore was the CBS correspondent in Berlin when that happened. Dan did a trip after the wall was built into East Germany and had one question in mind. And he set it up with me in Moscow. And I did essentially the same thing in the Soviet Union to the degree that I could. And the question was, what would have happened if John Kennedy had decided when that wall was being set up to smash it down? What would the Russians have done at that point? Would they have gone to war to set it back up? And what was interesting is that the East Germans, those Dan talked to, uniformly said Khrushchev would have done nothing.
Wow.
And in my sort of wandering around in the Soviet side, the degree to which I was able to get to any Russian or a Russian columnist or a Levitan on Russian radio, they were all hooked in. And they all told me we'd have done nothing.
Wow.
So it's an interesting little piece of history.
Let me just jump in. I see two young faces behind you.
Yeah.
And
Thank you for this story.
You're very welcome.
Very much appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd like you both to have a chance to come in, and there'll be the last couple of questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dante. I'm a student at the University of South Carolina, and I've actually had the pleasure of taking classes from your daughter, Judith Kalb.
Fantastic.
My question is that you, as someone who knows a lot about Russia, what would you say is the biggest misconception that Americans have either today or during Soviet times about Russia?
The biggest what?
Misconception.
Ooh, beauty of a question. Distrust. Distrust. A lot of good reasons for distrust, but it can't be the motivation that is constantly there. There are all kinds of people in Russia who would love to get on with the Americans, but Mr. Putin wants no part of that. In my judgment, he's the principal reason why we are now having the mess in Russian-American relations that we do have, and a very dangerous mess. And I think myself that Putin is a short timer. I know that that runs counter to the prevailing opinion, but it is my very strong belief that he is not going to be around for a great deal of time. And when he goes, who replaces him is fundamentally important to opening up the opportunity for better relations between these two superpowers. It must happen, because if it doesn't, we're all going to be in a terrible place.
We have time for one more question. Come on in.
Thank you. And I'm actually a journalist here at ABC News in Washington, so it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Koppel, and to listen to all your insights about how the industry has changed. But I wanted to ask you, Marvin, about how culture played into your understanding of the Russian people and Russia as a country. Now, as you mentioned, journalists aren't there. Evan Gershkovich, who insisted on staying, was arrested and imprisoned. So you can understand why journalists don't want to be there. But I wonder what it means to understand a culture about a foreign place, and if, as journalists, help society speak with each other. It sounds like you spoke with lots of diplomats who were speaking with Americans and vice versa. So I wonder how understanding Russia broadly helps in geopolitical relations.
It's incredibly important. Russia is a country that, in my opinion, again, lives by its literature, by its music. It is a cultured country, but it doesn't look like that. It looks like a militaristic country, and what they're doing in Ukraine is an example of militarism. And it's aggression. It is the worst side of Russia, but there is that side in Russia. And we're going to have to understand that place, because whatever is going to happen in Ukraine, there will always be a Russia. And there's always going to be an America, and we have to learn some way of getting along. And through culture and exchanges in writers and teachers and athletes, the kind of things that Khrushchev in his time stimulated, wanted to happen, and it did. Those things are not happening today, and that deepens the distrust and the they're just the displeasure with each other. And that's a most unfortunate thing.
So much, and this will be the last question, I'm afraid, it's 6 o'clock. So much of your book deals with the underlying theme of the fear of nuclear war. Khrushchev had that fear, Kennedy had that fear. Is it less today or is it greater today?
Ted, in that time in Russia, in the early 60s, late 50s, right through the 60s, there was a fear of nuclear war which was felt by many, many, many people. The society felt it, lived with that nightmare. For many, many years after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, it sort of took a vacation. And to me, it's about time, because when you realize what could happen, not just to both societies, to the entire world, if there is an exchange of nuclear weapons, nothing would be worth living in. And I don't think we take that in, I don't think we live in a serious way with that possibility, and we ought to. It is an essential part of our lives today, and we run a serious risk of downplaying it, of sort of putting it off in a corner as something that can't possibly happen. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were this close to that kind of war.
That's it, folks.